Okay, get ready for this one because this is going to be a heavy one. We're diving into the case of Marissa Wells. You guys sent in a bunch of news articles, even a Fatal Attraction episode from YouTube. Looks like you guys did some true crime homework.
Yeah, it's not just the crime itself, but the layers beneath it. We have suspects, but the more we look at this, the more tangled it gets. Secrets and assumptions and teenage emotions. It's a recipe for a disaster.
It seems like you guys are looking for more than just the who and the how here. So we're going to go beyond the headlines and dig into the psychology behind it all. Why did this happen? And trust me, the answers aren't going to be simple.
To understand the tragedy, we need to understand Marissa. She wasn't just a victim, she was a person. Dreams and relationships. She had a whole life ahead of her.
Exactly. So let's paint a picture for our listeners, right? 16 years old, Austell, Georgia. She's a straight-A student, active in her church choir, and she dreamed of being a photographer. We want to get to know her as a person.
Yeah, and people described her as bright, always smiling, truly loved by those who knew her, really close to her friends, involved in school, and very close to the grandparents she lived with.
So it sounds like a pretty normal life, but there were cracks beneath the surface. A strained relationship with her mom, and then there's this whole secret boyfriend. Adds another dimension to everything.
And that secrecy is really a key. Her relationship with Matthew Wilkins, he was a college basketball star 3 years older than her, and this was totally forbidden by her grandparents. So they were forced into having these hidden phone calls and these stolen moments. Just imagine that pressure cooker that creates for these two kids.
And it wasn't just young love pressure. We have to think about the world that Matthew was in. He was this college athlete, scholarships, maybe even pro aspirations someday. An unplanned pregnancy for him could really derail all of that.
Yeah, for sure. Society puts a lot of pressure on young athletes, especially when the stakes are that high. The idea of an unplanned pregnancy can be terrifying, not just on a personal level, but, in terms of their entire future.
So we have this picture of Marissa, this hidden romance, and then there's the crime itself. Even seasoned investigators were shaken up by how brutal it was.
Can you imagine her grandparents coming home from a funeral, and finding that scene? It wasn't just that she was gone. It was the violence of it. Truly horrific.
Initially, there were a few paths the investigation could have taken. Neighbors had mentioned other boys sneaking around, which made people think maybe jealousy or a love triangle. And then, boom, we find out about Matthew's other girlfriend, Kara Chambers, a college freshman.
It's like suddenly the web of relationships gets way more complex. Who knew what about whom? Were there resentments that we weren't aware of? It's a classic case of appearances can be deceiving, but this time the stakes are incredibly high.
And just when you think you're wrapping your head around things, Kara drops this bombshell, a rumor that Marissa was pregnant.
Oh, yeah, this is where the whole case pivots. This isn't just some teenage drama anymore. Now there's a potential motive here with some real weight.
Totally. It shifts the focus right onto Matthew. Was he scared? Did he pressure Marissa? This is where the psychology gets really interesting, right? We have to think about what he was thinking.
Especially when you think about those pressures on young athletes we were just talking about. A pregnancy could have meant he'd lose his scholarship, his future, everything he'd worked for. Even if, he wasn't a bad person inherently. Fear can really drive people to do some desperate things.
And it's not just fear on his side, right? We have Marissa's brother and her friends who say Matthew was furious about the pregnancy. Alleged threats over the phone, even on MySpace. Remember MySpace. Takes you back.
Oh, yeah, MySpace. It does paint a disturbing picture, doesn't it? But we also have to consider Marissa's perspective. She was devoutly religious, so abortion was not a simple choice for her. You can see her internal struggle, this clash between the love for Matthew and her faith, her own desires.
And in the end, she decided to keep the baby against Matthew's alleged wishes. So talk about a powder keg situation, right? You have these two teenagers, each feeling trapped, unable to communicate openly with each other, let alone the adults in their lives.
Which brings us to the investigation itself. With this pregnancy rumor out there, the police zero in on Matthew. And this is where things get really interesting. They get his cell phone records. Now remember, at this point, he's saying he hasn't spoken to Marissa in days.
Right, but the records tell a different story, don't they? They place him at Marissa's house right around the time of the murder. The last call was at 10:46 a.m., right when her grandparents had left for that funeral.
Yeah, so suddenly that seemingly solid alibi falls apart. Police get a warrant and search his family home in Douglasville. Can you imagine the tension in that house? His parents are ministers, they're cooperative at first, and then suddenly they lawyer up.
So they're looking everywhere. They've almost come up empty, and then they find it. Hidden in the attic under a pile of clothes, a pair of sneakers. And on those sneakers,
A tiny little speck of blood. It was almost invisible, but it was enough to change everything. He was arrested right on the spot.
talk about a turn of events. From rock-solid alibi to prime suspect, all because of a little blood stain. But remember, he's still innocent until proven guilty. The real test is going to come at the trial.
And that trial is going to show us just how tangled this web of relationships and assumptions and evidence really is. This is not going to be a simple open and shut case. The prosecution has a really compelling story, but there are holes, unanswered questions.
So we left off with Matthew's arrest, that tiny blood stain turning him into public enemy number one. What happened when we got to the courtroom?
Well, it was March 2010. The tension, you could cut it with a knife. The prosecution definitely came out swinging. They presented Matthew as this ambitious young man, future all laid out for him, and then boom, the pregnancy. Throws a wrench into everything.
They really pushed that fear factor. Scholarships, his reputation, maybe even NBA dreams someday.
Oh, yeah.
All gone. Poof. It's easy to see how that kind of pressure could push someone to do something crazy, even if they weren't a bad person to begin with.
Right. They weren't really trying to say that he was a monster or anything, but that fear and desperation can sometimes lead to good people doing really bad things. And, they had the evidence. They had those cell phone records showing that he was at Marissa's house when she was killed.
Yeah, which totally blew up his alibi, which his parents were backing at first. What a blow to their credibility.
And then there was the DNA evidence. So, for anyone listening who might not be super familiar with forensics, this wasn't some general, his DNA was at the scene kind of thing. They found his DNA on Marissa's body, suggesting that, they had been intimate shortly before her death.
Okay, so we have opportunity. We have a possible motive, if you believe their argument about the pressure. But what about actual proof that he was the one who did it?
That's where the blood on the shoes comes into play. The prosecution was arguing that even though it was just this little tiny speck, it matched Marissa's blood type. And they brought in these experts, blood spatter analysts, and they were explaining how blood spatters work, how it could have gotten on his shoes during a struggle.
So the prosecution's looking pretty solid, right?
Yeah.
Motive, opportunity, and they have some physical evidence.
Yeah.
What did the defense even have to counter that?
It was an uphill battle for sure, but they made some pretty good points. I mean, first of all, they said, cell phone records don't actually prove murder. Sure, he was talking to her, but that doesn't automatically make him a killer. And about that blood stain, they said it was so small it could have gotten there at any time, maybe days before, totally unrelated to the crime.
Yeah, makes sense.
Then they brought up how if he had really attacked her so brutally, wouldn't there have been more blood, on his clothes or at the crime scene? It didn't totally add up. But their strongest argument by far was this fingerprint that was found at the crime scene. And this fingerprint, it wasn't Matthew's.
Oh, well. Did they ever figure out who that belonged to?
No, they didn't. And the defense really hammered that point home.
Yeah.
They said this unknown fingerprint needed to be investigated more thoroughly. They said it pointed to another suspect, someone with a motive we didn't even know about.
So basically, they were saying it could have been anyone.
Yeah, pretty much. But the prosecution had already kind of put that seed of doubt in everyone's mind about Matthew and his alibi. And then they did something completely unexpected. They called a witness that nobody saw coming. Matthew's mom.
Oh, wow. That's intense.
Yeah, she was a well-respected minister in their community, right? So she takes the stand and swears on her faith that Matthew had been with her the entire day of the murder, giving him a rock-solid alibi.
I bet you could hear a pin drop in the courtroom. It's like her word against all this mounting evidence.
Absolutely. But the prosecution, they were ready for this. They started pointing out inconsistencies in her story, little details that didn't totally line up, and then, of course, they brought up those cell phone records again. If Matthew was with his mom all day, why was he calling her so often?
Almost like they were trying to make it look like they were together even though they weren't.
Exactly. And it worked because the jury started to really doubt her testimony. They wondered if maybe, she was lying just to protect her son no matter what.
So we have the prosecution's story, the defense's story. Who did the jury side with?
Well, after 5 very long hours of deliberating, the jury came back with a guilty verdict. Matthew Wilkins was officially convicted of murder.
Wow. What was it like in the courtroom when they read that verdict?
You could feel the relief from Marissa's family. They had finally gotten justice for their daughter, but of course, it was bittersweet. A young life was gone, families completely shattered. The weight of it all just hung in the air.
What about Matthew? How did he react?
Through the entire trial, he was totally stone-faced, showed no emotion. Even when they read that guilty verdict, no remorse, no anything, just blank. It really added to that image that the prosecution had built of him as this cold and calculating person.
So he was sentenced to life in prison.
Yeah, life plus another 20 years for aggravated battery. That term might be unfamiliar to some people listening. Aggravated battery in this case, refers to how brutal the attack was. It goes beyond just simple assault and really emphasizes the severity of what he did.
Justice was served, but it's just such a sad story. Young lives destroyed, families ripped apart. It's hard to imagine anyone coming out of this okay.
It really is. But there's one last thing, a final revelation that makes this whole thing even more heartbreaking and more complicated than we originally thought.
So you were saying there's one last revelation, something that makes this whole case even more heartbreaking. I'm almost afraid to ask. But what is it?
You know how that pregnancy rumor was basically the key to everything? It was the motive, and the whole prosecution's case, everything hinged on Marissa being pregnant?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seemed like that was the whole reason behind everything. The fear, the desperation, the alleged threats. Are you telling me that wasn't even true?
The autopsy showed that Marissa wasn't pregnant.
Wait a minute. Are you serious? All of this, the trial, the conviction, all because of something that wasn't even real.
It's hard to believe, but yeah. The medical examiner said it looked like she probably had some condition that was causing her to have really irregular periods. It's possible she thought she was pregnant, but it was all just a tragic misunderstanding.
This is just, I don't even know what to say. A young woman is dead. A young man's life is ruined. And it was all because of a miscommunication, because of fear that came from something that wasn't even happening.
It really shows you how fragile life is and how fast things can get out of control when you have fear and secrets. You have these two teenagers both feeling trapped, unable to talk to each other or to any of the adults in their lives who could have maybe helped them.
It makes you think about all the what ifs, right? What if they had been able to be honest with each other? What if their families knew what was going on? Could this have been prevented?
It's impossible to know for sure. But, it definitely shows how important open communication is, especially for young people who are going through tough stuff. They need to know that they can go to adults that they trust for help and advice without feeling like they're going to be judged or ashamed.
It's so easy to get caught up in that whodunit aspect of true crime.
Yeah.
But this case is so much bigger than that. It makes you think about communication, assumptions, and how much power fear has.
I agree. Marissa's story is a reminder that we need to be really careful about the assumptions that we make, the rumors we believe, and how we react when emotions are running high. Being able to talk openly and honestly, even though it can be hard sometimes, is so, so important.
This deep dive has been a real roller coaster. So many twists and turns. And in the end, you're just left feeling really sad. And it definitely gives you a lot to think about.
Yeah, it's one of those cases that sticks with you. It makes you think about relationships and how complex they are and how fragile life is. It reminds you that you always have to look for the truth, even when everything seems chaotic.
We hope you guys listening got a new perspective on this case. And maybe it'll start some conversations that need to happen. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.